Welcome to part 8, HTML syntax. So I want to talk a little bit more about the HTML language and how whitespace is processed. So HTML is not a programming language. It cannot evaluate logical conditions such as if-else statements. It cannot iterate with loops. It cannot do calculations, and therefore it just cannot solve technical problems. HTML is considered a markup language, and in fact this word markup is in its name. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So what does this markup part mean? Well, you can think of it as like a phrase like marking up a document. Say if you're editing, you're going to mark up something. But I think a good example is to think about publishing a magazine article from the 1950s before there was widespread computer usage. So think about you're submitting an article to some magazine publisher and you want to differentiate the words from how the appearance of the words. So let's say you wanted to make some of the text, larger font, a different color, maybe italic, use a particular font family, where you could mark up the document in such a way, maybe using tags, just like HTML, in order to separate the appearance of the words from the actual content of the words themselves. So you would submit this document that's all marked up, and then the person publishing the magazine article could understand, all right, they want this title to be this font, this color, this italic, this font family, whatever, and so you could use some sort of markup language in order to distinguish the appearance from the actual content. So that's where this term markup comes from. So as we know, HTML describes the components of the page, which you need instead of someone looking at this magazine article. We have specific rules for HTML, and then the web browser interprets these rules and then renders the HTML on your screen. So one interesting thing about HTML is that it always renders regardless of the format or number of mistakes. You cannot have a situation where your page will say, hey, there is an error in your HTML syntax on line 17, you need to go fix that. So regardless of what you write, the browser will always render something. So let's take an example of this. So say we want to create an H3 header, and even if we maybe forget our closing tag, let's say some header here, and we execute this, okay, so notice there's no error, nothing actually happened. And we'll just close it out, and we'll say actual content of header here. This will actually render. So it looks like we've tried to create some attributes in here called sum and header, but that did not work. Or it still rendered something, even though these are not correctly formulated attributes. But let's go ahead and delete that. And notice I actually forgot the right-hand side of this thing over here. So it actually still rendered, even though I forgot the right angle bracket closing off the closing tag. Let's say I want to create a paragraph over here. And I executed that. So it still rendered correctly as a paragraph, even though I don't have the closing tag anymore. So this is a syntactical error, but all web browsers have some rules, and I don't know exactly what they are, whenever an error occurs, to handle them in some way. So maybe it just assumes that needs to be a closing tag, and it will just add it there for you. Let's go ahead and delete that closing tag entirely. And now it looks like it's rendered the paragraph as a header as well. So it doesn't know necessarily to close it off here. We've left it off, we've forgotten it for some reason, but there's still something that was rendered. And that's the whole point of this line right here, is that regardless of what you write, something will get rendered. You will not see like an error in this page like that. Now, all modern editors of HTML will be able to point out these errors, and especially if there's misaligned tags without an opening tag without an aligned closing tag, it'll point that out. But regardless, if you submit HTML, it will get rendered regardless of how many errors there are. Okay, so that's that. Let's look at white space. So what's interesting about white space is that it is HTML is so outside of the content is largely ignored. And just to show that, we'll go ahead and create some header again. So when I mean outside of the content, let's create 2 tags over here. And when we execute this, we get the correctly rendered H3 and paragraph. Now, outside of the tag, so outside of the content, so say we have a lot of white space in here, it doesn't matter how much white space we have, it will still render it as a single line. And even if we put it in one line, it'll still render like this. So there's some rules about whether something displays inline or is in its own line as a block, and we'll talk about that in the next section. But the point here is that white space between the content is ignored, and that's what allows you to have say some div like this, and it doesn't matter if we have space at the beginning or the end. It does not affect the HTML whatsoever. We could tab this over quite a bit. All of that doesn't matter. Now, when I say largely ignored, there are some areas where it matters. So let's just say I have the H3 header like this, so I don't have it. So I do have some space between the left bracket and the right bracket. Well, that's actually not going to be construed correctly as an H3 header, and you can see that it just prints out the exact literal brackets with the H3 over here. So there are some areas where it does matter, but for the most part, white space is ignored outside of the outside of the content. No, so inside of the content. So let's go back over here so to have it correctly rendered, and we'll just tab it over since we'll say it's nested inside of a div. If we want to add lots of space here and maybe let's just say lots of space between those 2 words, when it renders, it'll still just be a single space over here. So it doesn't matter how many spaces you have, or if you try to go on multiple lines actually. So even though I have all of this white space, only a single space will be rendered. Doesn't matter how many tabs or new lines. So within the content, all white space will be rendered as a single space. So there are ways around or to provide line breaks and additional spaces, and those will be discussed at a later time. But for now, the just regular white space, whether it's just a regular single space or tabs or new lines, they will all be treated as a single space when they are rendered. Okay, so that's a little bit more about HTML syntax.